every desk. Xerox built the fire and refused to sell it. Apple took the fire and tried to trap it inside a single beautiful box. But Microsoft realized that if you make the fire cheap enough to burn everywhere, you eventually own the world. Before the mouse, before icons, before the desktop, computers were hostile. They were massive, expensive machines that only spoke in rigid lines of green text, completely inaccessible to anyone without an engineering degree. But tucked away in California, a group of researchers at the Palo Alto Research Center, or Xerox PARC, were quietly building something entirely different. In 1973, they created the Xerox Alto. It was the first computer to abandon the command line entirely. Instead of typing code, users interacted with a graphical user interface. They used a physical mouse to click on digital folders, windows, and icons. Even PARC hadn't invented these concepts out of thin air. They drew heavily from the work of computer scientist Douglas Engelbart, who first demonstrated a rudimentary mouse and visual interface in 1968. Yet the executives back at Xerox headquarters in New York didn't care. They were making over $1 billion a year selling photocopiers. To them, personal computers were an expensive research novelty with no commercial value. By the late 70s, Xerox had essentially paid for a decade of research, proved the concepts worked, and then left the lab doors unlocked for whoever happened to walk through. In late 1979, a 24-year-old Steve Jobs made a calculated offer. He granted Xerox the right to buy 100,000 shares of Apple stock before its initial public offering. His price was a guided tour of PARC. Within minutes of seeing the Alto's interface, Jobs realized he was looking at the future of computing. He immediately returned to Apple and ordered his engineering teams to drop their current projects and replicate what he had just seen. That pivot eventually produced the Macintosh. Released in 1984, it was the first machine to take the mouse and graphical interface out of the research lab and refine them into a product that anyone could buy and use. But hardware is useless without applications. To convince consumers to actually buy a Macintosh, Apple needed visual word processors and spreadsheets that took advantage of this new graphical environment. For that, Jobs brought in an ambitious software developer from Seattle named Bill Gates. Gates and his company, Microsoft, were invited deep into the secretive Macintosh project to build those essential applications. Having full access to Apple's prototypes, Gates clearly saw the same potential Jobs had seen at PARC. But he recognized a strategic flaw in Apple's closed ecosystem. Microsoft's growth would be entirely dependent on Apple's hardware sales. Rather than reverse engineering Apple's code, Gates went directly to the original source. He recruited Charles Simonyi, one of the primary architects behind the visual word processors at Xerox PARC. Simonyi brought Xerox's foundational engineering logic straight to Microsoft. His expertise provided the exact framework Microsoft needed to bypass Apple and develop its own graphical operating system. By hiring Simonyi, Gates secured the specific logic behind PARC's breakthroughs, moving the lab's intellectual core to Seattle without Xerox ever registering a loss. By embedding Microsoft within Apple's development cycle while simultaneously absorbing Xerox's talent, Gates executed a flawless maneuver. He positioned his company to control the software layer, reducing the actual computers to interchangeable boxes. In November 1983, months before the Macintosh was even available to the public, Microsoft announced Windows, an operating system with a mouse, drop-down menus, and icons. Jobs was furious. He summoned Gates to Apple headquarters and, in front of a room of engineers, accused him of ripping off the Macintosh interface. Gates remained perfectly calm and delivered a measured defense. He told Jobs that they both had a wealthy neighbor named Xerox, and when he broke in to steal the TV, he found Jobs had already taken it. Apple eventually took Microsoft to court in 1988, arguing that Windows infringed on the visual copyright, the specific look and feel of their graphical interface. The judge dismissed the majority of Apple's claims. The ruling established that visual elements like overlapping windows and icons were largely functional, and more importantly, that Apple's interface was heavily derived from prior art. This diagram traces that chain of custody. The core concepts originated with Douglas Engelbart in 1968, evolved significantly at Xerox PARC, were refined by Apple, and ultimately adapted by Microsoft. Apple couldn't claim exclusive ownership of an idea they had lifted themselves. Freed from the lawsuit, Microsoft licensed Windows to run on hardware built by dozens of manufacturers. They saturated the market, playing their software on the vast majority of personal computers worldwide, while Apple's closed premium model pushed them to the brink of financial collapse. By 1997, the dynamic had completely inverted. To prevent Apple from going bankrupt, Jobs had to accept a $150 million check from his greatest rival. The graphical interface evolved into the standard for billions of users, yet the financial and structural power it generated was captured by the strategist who prioritized putting a copy on every desk. Xerox built the Fire and refused to sell it. Apple took the Fire and tried to trap it inside a single beautiful box. But Microsoft realized that if you make the Fire cheap enough to burn everywhere, you eventually own the world.